Lauren, what do you got for us, man?
Well, before I begin with the topic, I picked up a few things this week. And one of them is going to make Dan very happy. The other one should make everyone very happy. So I found a store that was actually selling, unfortunately for, suggested retail price, but the great Paul Nash's The Beast with the Magic Sword,
Yes.
the third of the series, and the prequel, which is the cool thing about it. It's also the most fantasy of the bunch. It's a really bizarre film, and there are topless ninjas in it.
Sweet.
Yeah. And the other thing I picked up is not so much what the movie. I love the movie, but I already owned it. But how this movie is presented in this case is something that makes, I think, all of our hearts skip a beat. So it's not 2002's The Darkness, a film starring Anna Paquin. It's a haunted house film that I've always liked quite a lot. I know it doesn't have a greatest reputation, but my copy I bought this week is the Blockbuster rental.
Brilliant.
It does have the original art slipped in there, but this is going in my collection very proudly.
Nice.
So I want to talk a little bit about the reputation the horror genre has as a genre that has leaned into misogyny as entertainment. So close your eyes and imagine a world where London after midnight was only a YouTube click away, and where like Dwight Fry's murderous rampage was still in Bride of Frankenstein, Inglorious 35 millimeter. Imagine where all the money shots in Friday 13th Part 7 are still intact. Sounds like a better world than we have, It's where I want to live, but we don't live there. So how did we lose all this? Why did we lose it all? In some cases, the filmmakers and the distributors didn't think enough of the films, and they just threw away the footage because they didn't think it would make a difference to any of us ever. They didn't care like we care about the genre. But even more often, though, it was censorship, or really more precisely the fear of censorship, that had reared its ugly head. This was material that was considered obscene or nasty or out of touch with the common person. It had no place in like polite society, and it had to be controlled or eliminated or ignored. So today we hear all the time that the horror genre's past in particular is misogynist, that it has leaned into misogyny for entertainment value. Movies like Maniac, both the 1934 pre-code shocker by Dwayne Esper and the more modern Video Nasty by William Lustig, they were called anti-women. There was protests for both of those films, with claiming that these films were against women and were demeaning what it meant to be a woman. Same thing with Fulci's New York Ripper, infamously, and even Argento's Animal trilogy came across some real abuse in the press as being anti-woman. The knives are clipping off panties, and most of the victims are women. Having these kind of accusations hurled at a film does create a certain interest in the film, but it's interesting because it's really the criticisms that have drawn people to the movies more than the content. So I want to make it clear, though, that I'm not saying that films aren't sexist. Sexism is a very different thing than misogyny. Sexism can be extremely quiet. It can be extremely pervasive. It can be built into systems that were written in a time that's no longer today. I can accept that there is casual sexism in film. I don't think you throw the baby out with the bathwater if it's a great film, but it also has some sexism in it. You have to, as a viewer, make a determination about how much you can handle of that, right? But misogyny is a different monster, and lumping them together is just intellectual laziness. It's suggesting that there's no difference between growing up in a household that didn't value women as much as they should have, and so still carrying some of those traits in your language and actions, which is not a good thing. But it's a lot different than actively hating women and making one of your life's goals to repress women. Horror, when it's successful, always reflects our real world. We see dangers that are too honest on film, and they parallel our everyday lives, and that causes us to recoil. That's what we like to do when we watch these movies. We like being off-put. We like to scream. We like to feel grossed out or uncomfortable or laugh, because gallows humor is a thing. It's a real reaction we have, and all those are appropriate responses to misogyny. We should be off-put by it. We should want to scream or run away from it, or we should want to laugh at the person who's dumb enough to still have those attitudes, because it's like an edgy joke, right? It has some truth embedded in it that we can recognize. And so, you know, among all the murder scenes and jump scares and mass killers, there's something more there that we should really respect. And these movies are not endorsing the objectification of women or the downplaying of women's value, as much as they're exploring the reality that exists in our society and then amplifying it dramatically so that we're seeing a glorious magnification. And that's why we respond. We respond because we recognize that it's a part of our world. The best example I can give is from a film that I don't think anyone on this panel likes, but I don't care. I'm going to give it anyway. Hostel. At the beginning of Hostel, the three male leads walk through a cat house, and they look from room to room and see the silhouettes of women performing sex acts. And they're, of course, mouth agape, kind of in awe, the typical vision of male gaze that you can imagine. At the end of that film, they're forced through another hallway, and they're forced to see into rooms where these horrific acts of violence are being committed. The scenes are framed exactly the same, and they're meant to contrast each other and to explore the attitudes that these characters portrayed earlier in the film for what they would look like if you were on the other side. Horror is one of the few genres that can do that, because it's one of the few genres that can exaggerate so beautifully to make a point. Or, you see, normally it's not about making a point. It's not about affecting anyone's life. It's about connecting with people. Taking elements of our world that are not perfect and showing them in a light that makes you feel like you're part of that story, and that story has some weight and purpose. I've never been able to connect with a romantic comedy because I've never met cute with anyone in a supermarket. But I can connect with that concept from Hostel because I have found myself being a typical male at times, and my eyes have wandered, right? I can admit that. That's fine. It doesn't make me a horrible person. It's not my proudest moments, but when you see it elevated on screen and magnified, it feels like a real thing. And it's kind of rubbing your nose in some of your worst attitudes. I think that's healthy and legitimate, and I think it's surprisingly literate inside a genre that's consistently being downplayed for its intelligence. To not examine our societies, to become complacent in our failings, and that would be true misogyny, because to only put pleasant, reassuring images on screen, it just does not represent our world or our anxieties. We've all had that horror film we watch, and it tends to be increasingly the haunting movies, right? Because we are more and more skeptical as people towards that sort of thing. We have no connection with that, and overlaying a metaphor onto it is increasingly difficult, which is why most of those metaphors for haunted house films are now financial. But if we don't actually explore the violence and the threat of violence, then we can't get anywhere. And there's no questioning the fact that women have had a really tough time in our society at many points. We're probably living in a better time now than we ever have, and we should be very proud of that. And this is not a woke cry for help for anyone, but what it is saying is that the horror genre deserves its credit, that all along it was the unflinching look at the real problems. No other genre had the balls, inappropriately enough, to go after it. But this one did. That's why films like Miss 45, which really have no right to be called horror films, but they fit in the genre so perfectly, right? Because other genres wouldn't do this. Women have always had a tough fight in our society. Hell, probably every society. But while she watches these films, every lady gets to be the final girl of the story, at least for the running time. And they get to face down the worst of our culture, and they get to survive to tell the tale. Those who would censor or threaten to censor or even use language to demean the genre for attitudes towards women completely misunderstand horror.
That's how I always felt about Siskel and Ebert's reviews of these movies. Like you said, the horror genre is one of the only genres that looks at the darkness of humanity straight in the face and shines a light on it in an unflinching manner. Now, everybody has dark thoughts. Everybody has dark emotions. It's part of us, with yin and yang, the light and the dark. It's within us all. Even the nicest person in the world has a bad day where they think a thought that they wouldn't normally think, or even a thought that makes them shudder themselves, like, holy shit, I didn't think I was capable of thinking that way, right? But then you go to these movies, and that is like on the screen for 90 minutes, and it kind of forces you to deal with not only with the darkness around you in the world and in society and in humanity, but the darkness within yourself. And it's very important that we have that, because, you know, a mirror doesn't lie. And we need to have a mirror shoved in our face occasionally just to remind us who we really are. And to try to, like you said, demean these films and erase them and get rid of them because they're somehow morally reprehensible or offensive is kind of missing the entirety of the point. These movies are, like Siskel and Ebert would say, all these slasher films are a reaction to feminism. It's punishing women. Get back in the kitchen. What are you doing? Yeah, no, that's not what it's saying. It's more or less, if you think about it, the journey of feminism and what it's like to break out of that darkness and to announce yourself as an individual and as a person of meaning. You know, that and these bad guys that killed these women, they were bad guys. You're not supposed to enjoy what they're doing. You're supposed to enjoy what happens to them at the end of the film, because the best part of a slasher movie is when the killer gets killed or how it happens. Or, you know, they always have the evil, the more evil the character, you know, the more gruesome the death has to be to pay off all the things that they did throughout the film.
Right.
So I think most people are just missing the point entirely, and they're the surface thinkers, and they're the problem with society.
I Spit on Your Grave is a great example of what I'm talking about, in that movie is very frank with its rape scenes, multiple rape scenes. But you know what? Isn't that less offensive than downplaying rape? I mean, isn't it? The fact that it's uncomfortable shouldn't make it objectionable.
No, that film was originally titled Day of the Woman. It was the moment where the worm turned, right? And it was like, I am no longer going to be your victim. I'm going to turn the tables on you and make you the victim because of what you did to me. That was like the moment of, you know, I'm not going to take this shit anymore.
I think Joe Bob Briggs' commentary over that movie changed a lot of people's minds about that film, if you ever get a chance to listen to it. But a couple quick things, Lauren, great piece. I think Hostel would not have gotten that kind of reaction if anybody but Eli Roth had made the film, but because he kind of comes across as a glorified frat boy himself, they thought that that's the way he looks at the world. You know, and the other thing is that I think that these protests, I mean, I could be wrong, because you would know, only has to do with the movies. Like, you can be as graphic as you want in a book and no one's protesting, right? Absolutely. So it's only horror movies that get this kind of crap. But like short stories, literature, unless it's American Psycho or something like that, like nobody's protesting books because they don't read. America doesn't read.
Throughout the centuries, there have been protests. There have been book burnings, Slaughterhouse-Five. I mean, some of that stuff was covered even in a goofy movie like Footloose. Right. Like the Devil's Tritone, the different notes that you play in music is evil, and this instrument's evil, and the saxophone will turn you into a drug addict, and even, you know, the electric guitar and rock music and stuff. You know, if you're predisposed to that type of behavior, you're going to do it anyway. It doesn't really matter if the saxophone's involved.
To Cam's point, though, like Rath James White or Ed Lee have far, far, far worse well, worse, more graphic material in their novels than you could ever put on film legally.
Ever.
And I mean, it's not even close. It's ridiculously a big vista between the two. So yeah, you're right. There's something about film, probably because it's so direct in our society and so immediate. You look at a film for an hour and a half, you come away with the experience of having experienced it, and it was passive. You just sat there. It washed over you.
What about? I'm sorry.
No, I was just. I think if we had to work harder for film, we would treat it differently. The same way reading a novel we treat differently. Problem is we're making it easier to consume film, so it's only going to get worse.
Mark Kermode, when he reviewed Lars von Trier's Antichrist, he called it a misogynistic movie, and Willem Dafoe, who was there to promote it, said it's about misogyny. That's not the same thing as being a misogynistic movie.
Right.
Yeah.
I always, I'm sure I've mentioned this before, but whenever I hear the, horror being considered misogyny or misogynistic or slashers in particular, I always point out there's a reason why, it's called The Final Girl. It's always, not in every slasher, but in most slashers, it's a woman who survives because she's smart. She has all of her wherewithal. She's resourceful. And, she overcomes the big, scary, masked man who's holding the very large, sharp implement that he wants to penetrate her with. What's misogynistic about that?
You could make the argument that the underlying morality is of the good girl, the virginal final girl, is problematic. That's a much longer conversation, and I think it's much more nuanced than it usually gets. But that's the only one I would say that I can at least entertain.
Well, I always, when people mention that, I go, that's because slasher films are very Christian. They're very puritanical.
They're very, yeah, absolutely.
And also, John
because
Carpenter,
the audience was.
John Carpenter said that he didn't mean for that to be the interpretation of Halloween. He just said, well, Laurie's the one that's not distracted by other things, so she could see what was around her. He didn't mean it. I mean, of course, we know John Carpenter. If it was up to him, he'd have Laurie, being a pot smoker and that type of thing too,
She does smoke pot in that movie.
Oh, she does. She does. You're right.
But here's the thing. I think that, again, there's a societal predecessor to the slasher film, which was the urban legend. So all those stories about babysitters getting phone calls from within the house and Lover's Lane being interrupted by hooked hand killers. Those are the societal predecessor. And that's where the whole virginal thing comes from. I mean, we can talk about it, but that's going to take an entire 3 hours of another episode of REGIONFREE. But my main thing is I just would like us to get beyond this argument that presenting real problems that women deal with is somehow against women. It's insane. It really is. It's the wrong behavior.
Would I Spit on Your Grave or Miss 45, if they were released today, be called woke?
No.
You don't think so?
You know why not? Because they violate the line that the audience that would embrace them as woke won't go over. They both have early scenes that are really uncomfortable. So woke films tend to be, and I'm using that word to the best of my knowledge, okay? Because I realize that everyone, when they hear the word woke, defines it differently. For me, woke is not wanting to ever present anything but a glowing endorsement of a social group of your choosing. So nuance goes right out the window. That's how we have the Captain Marvel thing, right? Whereas it's like we just provide the best possible version, a flawless human being. It's ridiculous. And I still haven't seen Black Christmas. I can't speak to it. But if all the men in any given work are all completely troglodytes, that is the condition that grows out of the woke mindset as I see it, because it's prescriptive, it's not descriptive. Slasher films are describing the world around us and then amplifying them, whereas something like Captain Marvel is telling society how it should be, which is the difference. And I think that approach could actually work. The problem is where Hollywood is right now, there's zero chance of it work, because screenwriters can't sell nuance. It's not that there aren't good writers out there. There's incredible screenwriters out there. But when they turn to a producer and say, "Hey, how about making this?" The producer goes, "I can't cut a 30-second television ad for this. Go back to the drawing board," because that's where Hollywood is at. Independent film, you get a little more leeway, but it's still expensive to get an independent film released to any kind of audience if a profit margin is your goal. So
Right.
it goes back to what we were talking about before. We need a different distribution method for film.
We've been having these I Spit on Your Grave remakes and sequels coming out last few years. They just get buried at Walmart. So
Yeah, for some reason, specifically Walmart.
can I just real quick just throw out and say, I remember going into Walmart, I don't know, what was 10 years ago, and going into the movie section and seeing the original I Spit on Your Grave on Blu-ray there for $10, going, what kind of amazing world do we live in now, where this movie that was so buried in video stores is now right there on my Walmart shelf. You know, Last House on the Left, when that remake came out, the original was prominently there at Walmart, Best Buy. I'm like, oh my God, look at
But
this.
yet, if you turn around and look at the CDs, you can't find uncensored music anywhere.
Right.
That was the dichotomy of Walmart that always kind of struck me. It's like, if you're going to buy a rap CD or a metal CD, it's going to be the clean version because Walmart don't sell that trash. But you
Right.
could turn around and you could buy I Spit on Your Grave on Blu-ray. It's
Exactly.
like, it's either way, guys. You know what I mean? You're selling me a weird message here, and I don't understand what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Don't worry, we have a book in the next aisle over from media that actually condones slavery and genocide. So whatever. in every Walmart.
But hey, there are no fucks on that rap CD, so you're good.
Correct.
Yes.
Clips just like this, be sure to subscribe to the Region Free YouTube channel and also check out the Patreon to get exclusive content and become a Regionaire.